And now we have John Graham. We were just treading water here a little bit, John, while you got here. So please, the floor is yours.
Well, good afternoon, and first let me apologize for showing up late. For those that have ever been to a senior review board, they're always interesting, and that's where I was immediately before here. The fact that this was an interdepartmentally convened in a senior review board made it ever more challenging. So another one of the transformational issues that we're working on right now, and that is with Project Accord, which is trying to set up a capability analysis center that involves government, industry, and academia in collaborative analysis as opposed to more competitive activities that we're used to. This is probably going to be a somewhat different brief than you've had so far, I'm not sure. But I'm from CAE, the simulation company, modeling and simulation company here in Canada. My background is as an Air Force colonel, and in particular fighter operations. So what I'd like to take a look at is, and share my thoughts on distributed mission training, which is in fact a means to an end to get the policies that we're trying to get through NATO right now out into the field so that they can actually be used in the field. See if I can figure this one out. There we go. So I understand we're looking at transformation today, and before we start, I always like to define the terms that I'm going to use throughout it. The CF have defined transformation some years ago as the process of strategic reorientation, and it's in response to anticipated or tangible change in the environment, design mechanism, all of those neat things that we've come to know and love. If you look at it from a real theoretical standpoint, though, it's actually defined as altering the institution's culture. And by actually changing some of the fundamental assumptions upon which it's based, and therefore the processes, procedures, and institutional behaviors that come out of it. 10 years ago, pardon me? 10 years ago, General Hanaud in his annual report came up with this sort of transformational goal, and he recognized that we needed to change, and that in order to change, the outcome should be that we think, behave, and act as a node in a collaborative network. Of keynote there is, it's not the computer network he was talking about, it's the social and it's the organizational network. And that the war fighters, all three military environments, and I'm proud to say we're now allowed to say services in Canada again, the civilian colleagues in the department, the broader security portfolio, if it's a domestic operation, including all of those from Public Safety Canada, as well as allies need to work within that network. So if we're to translate that into a transformational goal, we actually need to train folks in how to behave under certain circumstances. And so we need a training capability that will provide individual, team, and collective training and addresses the demands of the future, which are interoperable, collaborative, integrated force employment. At the technical level, and I'm just going to yell here, can you still hear me at the back? I hate actually being... The technical level is fairly easy. We have computer systems, networks that actually trade stuff back and forth. It's the policies and the processes that are sometimes the impediments to effective exchange of data. It's when you start getting up here into the different organizations and having a same frame of reference. So we're looking at the conceptual level, and it's not until you actually get folks involved and collaborative working together that you're actually going to get that common view of critical information, because they're going to understand what may not be critical to them could be critical to someone else. And it's not until you get right to the top where you get interoperability based on common knowledge and experience that has a baseline in tactics, techniques, and procedures that are well understood by all that you're going to get the behavioral level in there. and that will be achieved through frequent and consistent collective training. We can go to the next. So why am I a big proponent of simulation? In fact, I'm not talking just about simulators. All training that we do right now is some form of simulation. We've not been able to get the enemy to actually play in our war games as the opposition forces to give us some experience on how to beat them when it's the real game. So you've got live, which is real operators in real equipment, human-in-the-loop decision-making, going up against some sort of simulated entity. You've got virtual simulation, which is real operators in representative equipment. That could be your flight simulator, your aircraft simulator, a ship combat operations center, but it's a simulator itself. And then constructive, which is a representative operator in representative equipment. It's all computer generated, no human-in-the-loop intervention. You set it and away it goes. It can be an intelligent agent that can actually perform in certain mannerisms depending on the inputs and outputs, but it's all computer generated. If you look at also the entire life cycle, it's best when you use an evolutionary approach to developing those models, and we could talk about that for another whole presentation. But right now we're just going to look at not the development and not the employment, but the generation of joint forces. So if we look at a simulation construct for an isolated platform or a device, there's always inside the vehicle, and this is what people think of when they think of simulators and simulation. It's the instruments, the cockpits, the controls and displays inside the vehicle itself. How does it handle? What are the crew duties and how can you train for them? If you go beyond that to the next level, there's attached to the vehicle. There's all the sensors, the weapons, the mission equipment, cargo or passengers in the back perhaps, and the support equipment that's there. And then external to the vehicle, you've got the environment, the weather, the elements, the geography, the terrain, what the terrain composition is, the threats to it, and all of the other battle space entities that are out there. This is what we normally think of, or folks normally think of when they think of simulation. So if you use them as isolated simulators, then you're going to do all the standard things. And they work extremely well. Emergency procedures, this is the best place to do them because you can actually take them to their logical conclusion, whereas in a real vehicle, particularly an aircraft, not such a good idea. Individual system procedures you can practice, the proficiency in weapon system employment, a variety of things, and the crew training and integration. For an example, you can do air-to-air intercept training on 3 different levels. You can do it from the airborne air controller and have everything else constructive. You can do it from the aerospace controllers on the ground with everything else constructive, or you can do it from the fighter interceptor perspective where everything else again is constructive. But at that point, you've done some of the stuff over here. You've done the individual pilot training in this case, and the crew training perhaps, but you haven't come across into the team or the collective training. And that's where you're going to get the biggest benefit and the biggest bang for the buck right now, because that's what it is you're trying to go with. The other stuff is the baseline. You must be competent in your own craft. If you're a pilot, you must know how to run your aircraft. If you're a ship's captain, you have to know your ship. But it's the other elements that you actually need to get some interaction with. And if you're looking at simulators, the operational equipment manufacturer can help you at the far end of the screen, but the farther you march over into the higher end simulation and training, the further you become divorced from that original equipment manufacturer, and the more you're into collective training that needs to be done some other way. The question then becomes, so why simulation? Why can't we just do it in the real world? And in fact, a lot of training is done in the real world, sometimes out of necessity, other times just because you don't have the assets. But simulation allows you to get an enhanced ability to generate a really representative complexity within the environment. The adversary's capabilities and order of battle, we've seen this in a number of instances with, perfect example is the air intercept training. Currently, we'll send up a couple of Hornets in Canada, and they'll go up against live assets like a Hawk, very small aircraft with a low radar cross-section, not much heat signature, and very little capability as far as jamming goes. And it's supposed to represent potentially a bare aircraft or a commercial airliner. Well, it's a little difficult sometimes for the air traffic controller to see it at the ranges that they want, and for the fighter itself. Whereas if you throw it into a synthetic environment, you actually get an accurate representation of the threat. And it's a better representation on the radar screen for the air weapons controller. You can throw in neutral and civilian entities that are normally reluctant to enter your real world games, and you can actually get a good representation of the friendly capabilities and the order of battle, so the numbers that you're looking at. The complexity we're talking about here is the number of entities, the variety of entities, and the interaction between those entities. That's what defines the complexity. You can reduce the cost, and the obvious one are fuels and expendables and weapons employed, but it's also the maintenance and the parts. And a big thing right now is the fatigue life on certain assets, whether it's a tank or an aircraft. The thing that's limiting the F-18s right now, and the reason they absolutely have to be replaced in short order, is they have essentially run out of fatigue life. It avoids real-world restraints and constraints in some way. It adds others. If you're looking at a high-performance aircraft, you don't get the physiological stresses you do in the cockpit. But if you look at real-world training, there are also restraints and constraints. There are airspace limitations for volume. In particular, in the States, they're having a tremendous difficulty in getting the volume of airspace, both horizontal and vertical, that they need to actually conduct realistic operations and train for them. But also blocks. Currently now, if you're flying, you'll have one set, the friendly forces, in a 5,000-foot altitude block, and you'll have the opposition forces in the other 5,000-foot block. It's an artificiality of actually doing it in the real world because you don't want your own assets running into each other. Speed restrictions are not an issue within a synthetic environment, so you really have a full-up system to go. The other one is system usage, particularly as you get into fifth-generation technologies. One of the issues they found with the F-22 is they're reluctant to actually have them turn on some of the systems in the real world because, well, if they turn them on, everybody's going to see them. And they'd rather have that surprise for the actual battle. The other one is everything in the synthetic environment is absolutely repeatable, recordable, and task tailorable. So you can actually set the objectives that you want and make sure that they occur. It lowers risk, and in fact, it lowers consequences, particularly consequences of failure. If you fail at the task because you've done something wrong, you hit the reset button and do it again. So why distributed simulation, though? And that is the crux of it now. All of those other things can be done currently with the simulation capabilities that we have today. But why are we moving toward distributed simulation? It's because it permits the inclusion of the human-in-the-loop decision-making process at multiple points along the simulation or the exercise. And that, in fact, is the one that adds the greatest complexity. Remember, complexity is defined not as just the variety and the number of entities, but the relationships and the interdependencies between those entities. The biggest wild card in any battle is not which tank you've got or which aircraft you've got, it's how it's being used and the decisions being made real time by the operator in the asset. So by having them in there and the human in the loop, it increases the fidelity, the overall fidelity of the simulation by orders of magnitude. It allows the familiarization in working with interdependent entities, and in fact, some cases with individuals. But it also demands a number of things. You need common reference points when you're running these things, common terrain data, common urban buildup, common weather, common synthetic environment, in fact. So you're divorcing the modeling of the aircraft or the asset itself from the environment in which it operates. In the real world, it's always common. There's no other alternative. If I'm flying in the airspace, it's the same airspace as the next guy at red flag. In a synthetic environment, though, with isolated systems, every asset to this point has been operating in a parallel universe. It may be very similar, but there's very little interaction in between. Some of that started to change, but it's changing very slowly. This was an exercise run back in 2004, 2005, I believe, Exercise First Wave, a NATO initiative where they had a number of F-16s that were out of the Netherlands. They had some White Force assets in the north of the UK. We had my good friend Claude Lavoie here running his F-18 in Bagotville. We had German Eurofighters in Munich, Italian Eurofighters in Turin, and Mirage 2000 simulators in France. And in fact, we also had, running out of the CAE factory in Montreal, when a cohort of mine was flying a MiG-29 simulator that we had developed. They were all in there, and they were looking to run a consolidated effort within a similar and a common synthetic environment to look at enhancing NATO's readiness for coalition air operations. Could we run an air operation within a common synthetic environment? And in fact, they did, not without some interesting times and some warts and some funny things on it, but it did run. The operational community in the nations were quite enthusiastic about the breakthrough, and then everybody went home. So, next one we have, when the UK guys went home, when the Brits went home, we go to the next slide, they decided to take it over and take a look at something that they could do nationally. So at the Royal Air Force Station at Benson, they have the Medium Support Helicopter Aircrew Training Facility. They decided that it was a good idea that First Wave brought everybody into a common synthetic environment. So they brought 3 Chinook helicopter simulators, 2 EH-101 Merlins, and 1 Puma together in one spot and linked them all up. They're all using common databases for terrain, the urban buildup, and the weather, and they can inject up to 500 computer-generated entities over the network. That includes friendly as well as hostile, land, sea, air assets, doesn't matter. They can train any type of mission from single aircraft tactical to 6 ship, just by what they connect to the network and what they keep off the network. So it's completely reconfigurable and fairly rapidly reconfigurable. And they have realistic ground, sea, and airfield or air battle replication, complete with sound and impact effects. The simulators make noises and they shake and rattle and roll. But it actually gets the ability of the aircrew to interact with one another and provide an opportunity to commanders to develop their skills. Another one that's come along is a coalition virtual flag. This is generally run by the US. Canada has F-18 pilots fly from simulators at Shirley's Bay here in Ottawa. The reason they're using the Shirley Bay simulator is the current F-18 simulators aren't able to be hooked up to the network at this point. They're currently undergoing an upgrade and should be very shortly. The Australians are participating from home stations at Williamstown and Canberra. The RAF have Typhoons and Tornadoes playing. And in fact, the US had enough assets that it would have taken 3 slides to list them. And we didn't really need that. The interesting part here, though, is in addition to the air operations, they actually started bringing in ground troops as well. And so all 4 countries sent teams for the Joint Terminal Attack Controllers. These are the folks that run forward air control operations during close air support. They hooked them up with their own simulators for a virtual battlefield, and they were sending digital 9 lines, which is the information required for a close air support mission, to folks that were sitting in their simulators, thousands of miles or kilometers away. And they were looking through a special set of binoculars that provided a 360-degree view of their virtual battle space. And when they looked there, the aircraft, when they were directed, were looking at the same point in the virtual synthetic environment. It permitted them to actually distribute forward air control so that they could run close air support runs and operations, just as they would in the field. So moving closer to home, we have the Royal Canadian Air Force strategy, and this is stolen from a DND-CF slide that says the Air Force want integrated effects, and in fact they're looking at strategically relevant, operationally responsive, and tactically decisive, which then implies to me there's a good decision process in there, supported by effective, efficient, and adaptable defense institution. We can see there's a land-sea-air interface down here, and that all of the assets are going to that one point in space, and that you're looking for focused and integrated effects. But how do you actually get that to happen other than by serendipity on the battle space if you don't train for it? So we come back to this. You don't always have the assets real world that can do it, and even if you could have the assets on the friendly side, you may not be able to generate them on the unfriendly side. So the Royal Canadian Air Force actually have a distributed mission training network concept of operations. It's published, it's being fleshed out right now, and it has a mission training operations center at Shirley's Bay at the Aerospace Warfare Center detachment here in Ottawa. And their ambition is to connect all of the different Air Force wings that have virtual training devices to the Distributed Mission Operations Center here in Ottawa, so that they can, in fact, run distributed mission training sessions. You might note that there are 2 blue dots, one in Newfoundland, one in Labrador, that are technically Air Force wings, but they don't have any virtual training devices, so they're not on the network. The advantages to this are connecting individual simulators to the network. It does connect the human in the loop. So you're actually getting interdependent decision-making of a variety of different folks that are actually operating virtual training devices. The Distributed Mission Operations Center gets to control the common synthetic environment in all its glory. But right now, it really is limited to Air Force. And I've had discussions with folks both in Winnipeg and here in Ottawa on the air staff and at 1 Canadian Air Division. And they're aware that, in fact, they really need to be expanding out into the full joint spectrum. For example, the Chinooks and the Griffins, although they're Air Force assets, are basically chopped to the Army for tactical aviation support. Operational control reverts to the Army. If you're looking at maritime patrol, anti-submarine warfare assets, the Sea Kings, the soon-to-be Cyclones, the Auroras, they're owned by the Air Force, but they're essentially operated by the Navy. And if we get this hooked up and it's running properly, then it will act as a single point of presence to connect down to the US Distributed Mission Operations Network and allow us to tap into that whole system that's down there. NATO has got an idea that they'd like to leverage in and link all of the national assets that are there, and so they're looking at a NATO Distributed Mission Training network as well. They like to run virtual distributed CAMEOs. So I mentioned the Griffin and the Chinook. This is one that's actually on the books. We at CAE have produced MRTTs, which are Mission Rehearsal Task Trainers for the Griffin, which actually provide a lower fidelity flight simulator but add the mission kit to the simulation devices. The issue is the CONOPS for the Chinook has a 2-ship escort of Griffins going with it. The unfortunate part is the squadrons where the Griffins aren't co-located with the Chinook. So the question then became, how do we train for operations in advance of those operations if the assets aren't together? The answer was, we can try and start doing it in a distributed manner where you actually have the Chinook simulator in Petawawa, and it doesn't matter whether the MRTTs are in Valcartier or Edmonton or Gagetown, they can still play. If you look at fighter operations, there's a move afoot to connect Coal Lake and Bagotville for fighter operations so that they can do 4v4s or 2v2s against each other. But more and more they're looking, as I mentioned before, to get the 22-wing folks, the aerospace controllers, involved. They actually get better training, and you're not using your precious air live flying assets for something that's giving you less than full return on the petroleum and the pilot's time. Also hooking up to 1 Canadian Air Division because that is where the Combined Air Operations Center is. So if they can be monitoring flight operations in a synthetic environment that represent what they should be looking at later, it's a much better, higher fidelity training for them. But it's not just necessarily hooking up friendly forces and having all constructive. This is the Joint Strike Fighter Training Center that's currently operating down at Eglin Air Force Base, and it's an international training center. So they've got a large throughput, and they've got a number of simulators there. In fact, 10 full mission simulators for the Joint Strike Fighter are up and running at Eglin. What we suggested, though, is that Canada would never need 10. In fact, we're not getting 10. I would suggest we're probably looking at getting 4 at Bagotville, 4 at Coal Lake, because it's going to be a 4-ship that is the standard operating entity for the Joint Strike Fighter. But if we modified them, one of the things that came up, and again, I keep coming back to this human in the loop, one of the big lessons learned with the F-22 is the fact that when the F-22 pilots were doing their simulator rides against fully constructive entities, meaning computer-generated forces, there was training value, no doubt. But it's very dynamic, and it's a high rate of change. They found when Lockheed Martin provided them a facility at their test center in Marietta, Georgia for training systems, if they had other simulators that were manned by human in the loops, the training was much better for those pilots. And so what we're suggesting to the Crown is, if they set up their 4-ship pod of F-35s, or whatever next generation fighter they happen to get, they don't want to throw away the assets they already own. So a lot of it is reuse of assets that you already have. They're just in the process of upgrading their F-18s. Don't throw them away in 5 or 6 years' time. Keep them and revert them over to Red Force, opposing forces, where you can actually get human in the loop and reuse that asset to its maximum. NATO's interest, again, they're not going to purchase networks for us nationally, nor are they going to provide us with simulators. They want to leverage national members' capabilities. And they want to provide previously unavailable training opportunities to a number of nations that may or may not be able to deploy the distances that they're looking at. The other one is they'd like to provide a benchmark for member nations' interoperability targets, particularly as it results to simulation assets, so that they can tie into the network when they're allowed, and to allow for increased human-in-the-loop interaction and familiarization prior to that operational deployment to make sure they can do it. So there's a whole bunch of examples that run through here connecting different simulators, and I suspect the presentation will be put online for folks to see or sent out. And in fact, these are different scenarios that we've worked out while working at a NATO industrial advisory group looking at advanced distributed simulation for air and joint operations. Running through, the biggest one that NATO's looking at is to get distributed mission simulation for their AWACS crews, who quite often have difficulty in getting target aircraft. If they can connect their simulator, which is currently under upgrade, to a number of allied simulators, then they can actually get the human in the loop and run through that. We can just run through these very quickly, and you can look at them later if you're so inclined. But we'll look at the 2-ship. Next slide would be probably up to the 4-ship. And again, the more entities that you get involved with human in the loop, the higher fidelity the simulation becomes, because the human is the wild card. The next one goes to 10, I think. And then finally, we're into the conclusion, because I believe the Admiral has arrived. So distributed mission training, why do we want it? We kind of talked about that at the start, and really it gives a more complete representation of the battle space. It has fewer restraints and constraints with regard to weapons employment, system employment, airspace restraints. It lowers the cost, lowers the risk, and lowers the consequences of failure, and it increases critical interdependent human-in-the-loop interactions. It is complementary training to live simulation. It doesn't replace it. I had command of a CF-18 squadron, and if someone told me I needed to do all of my training in simulation, I would be somewhat reluctant to give a combat-ready status to one of my pilots. So you're not going to replace it completely, but it will elevate the competency and the readiness of participants so that when they do go into the live training environment, they can maximize that opportunity. But it does demand networking the individual training devices, and that can only be enabled by interoperability standards that are defined and consistently enforced. And I think that might be it. That is it. So thank you very much for your attention.
Do we have time for a couple of questions, Julie? Yeah, let's see if anybody has any pressing or questions on to either of our panelists, and then we. Oh, I see. Okay. If there are any questions, please come to the microphone. Please state your name and your organization. Thank you.
My name is Georgi Ivanov. I'm from Carleton, U here in Ottawa. And my question is specifically related to, I guess, both of you. In respect to the less capable members of the Alliance, I've heard talk and discussion about pulling together resources. For example, 2 or 3 countries can have a single air force, or combining maritime resources to form a single battle groups. And basically going above the nation state and above national Air Force, Army or Navy to form a multinational combat units. Can simulations or respectively policy measures to make this happen occur at NATO in the near future, or is it a long-term perspective? Thank you.
Well, I'm happy to perhaps kick off. Again, going back to I think where you see the Secretary General wanting the smart defense narrative to go. He very much does want nations to be looking at perhaps that ability to again adopt multinational approaches to fielding capabilities, and to perhaps also taking on responsibilities. And he's a he's a Dane, and he will always put that in context of a decision that he took when he was the Danish Prime Minister, but making a hard decision to divest of certain capabilities that they had because they were going to adopt an approach that required them to cooperate with other allies with regards to some maritime capabilities. And so I think that's where the narrative will go. And again, as I talked earlier, it's not a one approach fits all when it comes to where nations fit within the alliance with regards to generating capabilities. But I certainly think that you or the SecGen would like to see more of that discussion as we head towards a summit and then beyond.
Yeah, as far as simulation support goes to it, the whole intent of an alliance is to in fact combine different militaries, whether it's an Air Force or an Army or a Navy, and to allow you to pick and choose what niche capabilities you may or may not want to embark upon, because quite frankly it's getting very expensive to do everything. The US is probably the notable exception, Britain very close behind, of full capability air forces, navies, and armies. Everybody else is picking and choosing contributions that are significant and useful to them. If you're talking about a standing organization, the one that comes to mind for me is NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, where in fact Canada and the US have chosen a binational agreement that is now set in perpetuity in order to combine our air defense assets for the protection of North American continent. Now, interestingly enough, when we talked about distributed mission simulation, one of the most interested folks was Lieutenant General Tom Lawson, who's now the Deputy Commander of NORAD. He had previously been discussed with a variety of things that are being provided to the Air Force, one being the Operational Training Support Provider vehicle that we had previously said, it gives you commonality of terrain databases, computer-generated forces, a variety of things as a cost reduction mechanism. It wasn't until he came along and said, that has actually set the stage for you to, over a network, be able to have a common synthetic environment using those common databases the common weather modeling, the common computer-generated forces to connect your various simulators, regardless of where they are in North America or in NATO for that matter, and operate as a single entity wherever you want. So in fact, one of the chaps that was playing with at Carleton University in the VSIM facility with the Griffin simulators before they were shipped out to the individual units, he took off out of a checkpoint over in Afghanistan and basically gave us a running commentary of all of the landmarks that he had used as particular reporting points while he was flying 2 tours in Afghanistan. So the realism that you can get in running through these and then combine everybody into it, you can really get some good synergies.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And we have the Vice Chief of the Defence Staff standing by, so thank you for your attention for the panel, and thank you to the panelists for your presentations and your comments.